Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Vega. I will be the moderator for today's Saturday Town Hall meeting for February 11th, 2023. Our guests are Harley Schlanger and Mike Robinson. But before we get to them, there have been a lot of explosive revelations coming out these last 2 weeks, as well as a lot of explosive actions that have been taken, some by myself, my colleagues, and even other people in other countries in the form of interventions. So we've kicked off the new year last month explosively, as everybody around the world should be doing, and mobilizing against nuclear war. And to start us off in our discussion, I would like to go first to an interview that was done, taking place this morning between Garland Nixon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We'll be playing just a portion of it, and the complete interview is available later today on the Schiller Institute YouTube channel. So let's just go right to that.
Hello, this is Garland Nixon here with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. You will forgive me if I mispronounce your name, but we're here today to discuss the extraordinary revelations that have come out by Seymour Hersh about the Nord Stream, the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. Helga, you are in Germany at this time. What are your thoughts on the impact of this on the German citizens, and of course, whether or not it's actually getting out in the media and how much people know about it?
Well, I think it is very interesting. Basically, the mainstream media are trying to either not report it or make ridiculous. Yesterday, there was a little discussion in the Bundestag where one rather youngish CDU parliamentarian that basically tried to discredit Seymour Hersh by saying, oh, this 85-year-old guy, who 50 years ago got a prize for journalism, as if Seymour Hersh would not be the most integer and decorated investigative journalist probably in the whole Western world. And it is amazing because you can see that everybody who has thought about it, who has looked at the facts, starting with, for example, the former foreign minister of Austria, Karin Kneißl, she gave an interview where she said that it was clear to her many years ago, long before this happened, that the United States was not intending to ever let this pipeline become operational. And, if you have that intention in mind and then look at what Biden said on February 7th when Scholz was standing there beside him like a little schoolboy. I mean, here is Biden saying, we have the means to make sure this pipeline will be finished. And then Scholz stands there and he doesn't say a mumbling word. I mean, look, it is right now becoming very, very clear that, obviously, I only can go by what Seymour Hersh is saying and that what other sources have been saying. I talked to a lot of military people in Europe and they all concur that given the fact that the Baltic Sea is one of the most surveyed pieces of Earth, anywhere, because of the Cold War, because of, the proximity of Russia and so forth, there is no way how this could have done without the United States either knowing about it, approving of it, or having it done themselves. I mean, it's simply a technical impossibility. So in light of that, which must be known to all German intelligence services and politicians in the upper echelons, to then stand up and say, oh no, this was the Russians, it's so blatant, and I personally think this will not go away. Because, there may be an attempt to cover up, but I think the longer they wait, it will get worse because the trust in the government defending the interest of the population will get eroded more and more and more, because the consequences of this is that energy prices have increased so much that it threatens the livelihood of many people. The lower income bracket, are really having a hard time to even get to the end of the month. Many small and medium businesses go bankrupt. There is a threat of deindustrialization of Germany. So this is not just something, this has consequences in the real world, which hits the common people. And therefore, given the fact that many people already suspect what Seymour Hersh is saying, I think the longer the cover-up goes, the worse it will get.
What you brought up something that I think is very important. I'd like to get your thoughts on it, and that is the question of who the ruling elite class represents. The question of whether or not they represent the people, or whether or not that they are the comprador class, as they would say in Africa, whether or not they are simply people who work for the neocons in Washington, D.C., work for the U.S. empire, and that they ensure that the dictates of the U.S. empire are exacted upon the German people, that it's a top-down control paradigm instead of an actual democratic paradigm. Do you think the German people, and adding to that, the fact that the bases, it's clear now that the military bases, the U.S. military bases, are bases of occupation as opposed to, Cold War style defense from Russia. Your thoughts on that dynamic, and whether or not you think that is becoming either discussed or apparent in Germany?
Well, right now, I think that because of this disgusting obedience of this present ruling coalition in Germany to the dictate of London and Washington, because don't forget London, because they are among the warmongers always number one, as you could see by the various deployments of Boris Johnson in the Ukraine. When there was a possibility of negotiations, he flew in and basically ruined it. And in the recent period, you had several British generals who said NATO should confront Russia directly, boots on the ground in Ukraine. So, I do not underestimate the role of the British in that. But the fact that the German government lets itself be drawn into this scenario by, delivering more heavy weapons to Ukraine, howitzers, at a point, then light tanks and heavy tanks, and now the demand for fighter jets. A year ago, Scholz said, he does not want to send any more weapons, especially not heavy weapons, to Ukraine, because that increases the danger of World War III. And now he's doing it. So, this is unbelievable. And I think that servility is really something which we have to mobilize the population against, because this is the existence of Germany which is at stake. What they are doing, in not talking about, what do you need enemies for if you have friends like that? Give me a break. I think this Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, in its implication, is enormous. And I think the ruling elite, they're not so much an elite, but an establishment, the implication of that is enormous. If you think that you are in a NATO alliance where, the big bully is using its capabilities to knock down the pipelines of an ally, and that means, that then now the United States can sell expensive LNG gas to compensate for the cheap Russian gas. If Germany swallows this, they're lost. That's my view.
Something I'm glad, we certainly do want to discuss what we can do to address this, but you brought up something else that I think is critical, and that is the issue of an alliance, of the NATO being an alliance. If we look at Norway, according to the article, to Sy Hersh's work, the U.S. approached Norway, and Norway looked at it as a business opportunity. That we can sell gas and this will work out for us. So Germany there wasn't even a discussion or thought as to whether or not Germany would be attacked. Furthermore, we saw Poland. We saw Radoslaw Sikorski, I believe it was, immediately afterwards, a very well-known and formerly high-ranking German Polish official, celebrating on Twitter unabashedly. Your thoughts on the dynamics of being able to maintain the facade now that this is an alliance to protect countries from a Russian invasion, as opposed to, a captured group of a group of captives who are held under coercive means together by a basically an imprisonment in a political, economic, and now we see military imprisonment under the threat of violence and coercion.
Well, I would add what Liz Truss said. The moment the pipeline was blown up, she tweeted to Blinken or sent a message to Blinken, "We did it," instantly. So, I think the NATO question will be eroded by this because, right now there is the NATO as it was formed as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union has clearly undergone a transformation where they are now becoming increasingly the tool of the unipolar world. This is not hidden, this is open, At the recent meeting of NATO in June in Madrid last year, they said, now we go for global NATO, and they are moving very rapidly to do that. Recently, there was an agreement between the EU, von der Leyen, and NATO to basically have an alliance between the two, whereby a member of one is automatically, access for the member of every of the other one, every one. So it's a total interlinking. Now, have I been asked if I agree that, I being part of the European Union, that I want to be part of global NATO? And, it's not just the EU, NATO. You have the AUKUS. This is the military alliance between the United States, Australia, and UK. Then you have the military agreement between Japan and the UK, the so-called reciprocal access agreement. So you have an interwoven network of military alliances for what? The only aim is the showdown with first Russia, naturally, but then with China. And you had this U.S. General, I think Miniham or some name like that, who said basically, there will be a war with China over Taiwan in 2 years by 2025. And then you have the Rent study, which said basically let's not have a long war in Ukraine because, we basically must have ammunition and every resource ready for the coming confrontation with China. And I don't want to have a showdown with China because I think this whole thing is so insane. Why should we continue to go for a confrontation which can only end up in World War III? And if it comes to World War III, that will be the end of civilization because, as several nuclear experts have clearly demonstrated, there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war because it is the nature of nuclear war that once one weapon is used, all of them will be used. And that means there will be a nuclear winter of 10 years minimum, which will destroy the life of everybody who has survived the first hours and first weeks. So that will be the end of life on the planet. And that's what these people are playing with. And this is why I think this idea of global NATO and what it implies needs a much broader discussion than we are having it right now.
If you're just tuning in, what you just watched is an interview taking place between Garland Nixon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We played just the first 12 minutes of it. The complete interview is available to be watched right after this show on the Schiller Institute, and I hope that little preview you saw there will entice you to want to watch the rest because it is a very good and fruitful discussion. Now, I want to just take a minute here to just showcase a rally that is happening in Washington, D.C. on February 19th. And if you take a look at the screen here, it's called the Rage Against the War Machine. It's happening February 19th, and it is comprised of a coalition of many different organizations, far left, far right, everything in between. These are some of the organizations that are part of the coalition. And then these are the speakers, Jimmy Dore, Ron Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Denis Kucinich. I mean, we've got just like a whole bunch of people. Diane, our very own Diane Sayre, is one of these speakers too. And so this is happening at Washington, D.C., February 19th. The rally is scheduled to start at noon. Yeah, I would invite everybody to be there. And one of the ways that we are taking action, not just by demonstrations in the street, but also in the form of interventions. This is a process that goes way, way, way back. The intervention process has been done, in all of American history, going way back to World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War. People have been calling out people forever. And so the LaRouche organization and the movement revived the practice of the intervention. And I put together a montage of the interventions that we've done in just these past 2 weeks. The first one you'll see will be my friend Kynan calling out Congressman Espaillat at an event called State of the District. And present at that event was Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, New York Governor Kathy Hochul, and New York City Mayor Eric Adams. And this was supposed to be lauding the achievements of how great the district has gotten. Then the second one you will see is Daniel Burke, who is crashing a fundraiser for the Democratic Party that is being hosted and attended by Chuck Schumer himself, AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jamal Bowman, and a whole bunch of other Democratic insiders. And then finally, you will see Kynan again and myself calling out the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Damon Wilson. And so I'll let these speak for themselves.
Congressman, when are you going to tell the people of your district that Germany has just declared war with NATO on Russia? Are you going to tell your district that we're on the brink of a nuclear war with Russia? Because guess what? A nuclear war will fuck a lot of things up. When are you going to actually do something for this district? When are you going to seek diplomacy with Russia? That is the most important thing concerning the people of this district. You have to make peace with Russia.
And we could have also the respect of law enforcement for our communities. We could have both. We could have both, and we deserve to have both.
It could be used to support people in the Bronx.
Last Congress.
Do something for the people of your district. Stop calling out illegal leaders of the party.
Well, we love her.
Congress members, when are you going to pull us back from the verge of nuclear war? In October, these progressives said there's a threat of nuclear war. We need to sue for peace between Russia and Ukraine. They retracted it. When will you come to the table like President Lula has, like Pope Francis has? Are you a Catholic? He's calling for a peace summit.
We will, man. We got you.
Let me say what I say first, man. Schumer is taking us to nuclear war. We are going to nuclear war because of these bastards. Are you going to wake up, people?
No, we're not going to wake up.
Tanks.
Bye-bye.
Sending it in.
Bye-bye.
NATO.
Bye. All right.
As I was saying,
Anyway. Excuse me, what about the corruption that the United States brings to all these other nations in the world? Afghanistan, we've taken over $9 billion in their foreign assets because we supposedly don't like the government, so we can condemn their population into starvation. What about Iraq? We went in there under false pretenses, under weapons of mass destruction, and we've left destruction in that nation. What about Syria right now? There's a terrible earthquake.
We're not here for that. Can you just sit down and listen to the talk, please?
And we're not sending them any aid because of these
Please sit down, sir. You can be escorted out.
There is no democracy that we're pushing in all these different nations. It's just fascism. It's just fascism. The United States is a fascist country. Come on.
The world has rejected your democracy. Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, everything you've tried to do has failed, and you will be forgotten. You are a plague, and guess what? The world has superseded your bullshit. No one will take it anymore. There is no democracy you're promoting. You've only brought death, and you know that, but guess what? It hasn't worked. You're going to die off like the plague you are. You are just like Ozymandias. Nothing will remain.
And that bit at the end there was them snatching my phone away and then threatening to delete the footage. But I got my phone back and obviously the footage. If you're just tuning in, what you just watched was a montage of 3 different interventions that we've done. These were excerpts, except for the last one it was the full thing, but these are excerpts of the interventions were a little longer than what I showed you. They're all available up on my Twitter, which is at Hosbytrigga, JOSBTRIGGA, or on this YouTube channel or on other YouTube channels. Before we go to our guest speakers, I just want us to hear from one more person, and that is Lyndon LaRouche.
What I shall do today is present the evolution of the policy which is presented to us by the coming visit of the President of China. The history of it, as I was personally involved in developing that policy over a long period of time, partly as a personal effort and later as an effort which began to make some impact on the shaping of the policies of the world during the course of the 1980s. The crucial thing to all of these parts of the world, whether it's Africa, South Asia, East Asia, is to provide to these sectors of the world the right to development. The right to development involves education, infrastructure development, and above all, the machine tool design capability without which you cannot have continuous sustainable development. You cannot simply go into a barren desert and set up a factory and expect to have a productive economy. You must first of all provide infrastructure, you must provide economic transportation, water management, power, and so forth. You must have educational systems, health systems, all of these infrastructural elements which are necessary for successful modern economy in that locality. That is, you must measure the density of infrastructure in terms of per capita of labor force, in terms of square kilometer of relevant area. The ability to transfer technology and to develop it depends upon the ratio of the number of persons employed productively in a machine tool sector industry to the total number of persons employed in the economy. There's a ratio of the rate of technological progress per capita in the machine tool sector as compared with the projected rate of technological progress per capita in the labor force as a whole. This is the key, the indispensable key to economic progress. Without it, you can't have it. Thus, that was the principle of the sector. That by developing land routes of efficient, high-speed transportation throughout Eurasia, and using these routes not only to support trade and industry, but to support the transmission at a high rate of the machine tool design sector into these countries, then and only then would it be possible to lift the greatest part of the world population, which is concentrated in South and East Asia, and also in Africa. Secondly, to lift these parts of the world out of the legacy of 19th century imperialism and the legacy of second-class citizenship in world affairs. Now, how did this happen? The key event, which is relevant to my role in this, occurred beginning December 1981 and to a period through 1984. In December 1981, I had run as a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1980 against Jimmy Carter. And thus, because of the position I had there, in that respect, as a former presidential candidate, pre-candidate, and because of other things I'd done, that it was decided by some people in the U.S. government that it would be wise to have me as a private citizen respond to a Soviet probe which had requested that an additional back-channel discussion be set up between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government. So I agreed to undertake this exploratory discussion, but made one recommendation, which is conditional in the sense I said if I'm going to be useful in this kind of discussion, there are certain things I should discuss which are of concern to me, which become the basis for this kind of exploration. I had been concerned for some time with two things. From my time of my military service in China, Burma, India theater during World War II, and I'd been concerned with establishing economic justice for the world after seeing Asia. And that had been my personal commitment, that we must change affairs so that the so-called underdeveloped or former colonial regions of the world could participate in justice. And so I've been involved heavily with third world questions and had gotten myself into a great deal of trouble in certain circles because I had been an advocate of the third world. At one time, the FBI was going to have the Communist Party of the United States assassinate me. There's a government document on that subject back in 1973 as a result of this kind of thing. But in this, the second thing I was concerned about was that the agreements on détente, which had been reached, specifically reached during the course and aftermath of the 1962 missile crisis, were themselves a danger, a risk to civilization. That the system of détente, that is of nuclear mutual deterrence, had become the potential trigger for an accidental war. And that therefore we had to concern ourselves with this problem of ballistic missile defense. So this policy, which I had devised, which was part of my 1980 presidential campaign, a key, shall we say, plank in that campaign, was that the United States should propose to the Soviet Union and other powers that we agree on developing an efficient ballistic missile defense to be common to all powers, so that no longer would be faced the threat of thermonuclear extinction with no defense against thermonuclear warhead missiles. And that this collaboration among the United States, the Soviet Union, and other powers should be technological collaboration extended to all nations, to the purpose of using these technologies, which were then called in diplomatic language new physical principles, to the benefit of the development of all mankind, with a special emphasis upon what is called then the developing sector. This was the policy which I used as the pivot of my exploratory discussions with the Soviet government during a period from February of 1982 through February of 1983. I had indications from the Andropov government that this would not be acceptable to Andropov, but they were interested in the economics. The President of the United States, various ways, adopted this idea as a good idea, President Reagan, through his people in the National Security Council with whom I was working. And on March 23rd, 1983, as you recall, the President of the United States brought in a concluding segment of his televised broadcast, announced what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, whose content was to propose to the Soviet Union exactly what I had outlined to the Soviet government in my back-channel talks. That action by the President changed world history. It didn't change it the way I wanted it changed, because very soon the mice, including the Heritage Foundation mice, got at the operation and turned the SD around and changed its purpose. But that concept of using these most advanced technologies, which still exist potentially, and using these as the shared technologies, shared among various nations, technologies based on expansion of the world's machine tool design capability in terms of these new technologies, should be used for transforming the world into the kind of world which, among others, President Franklin Roosevelt intended to put into effect at the end of World War, had he lived to do so.
If you're just tuning in, you just watched a talk given by Lyndon LaRouche back in 1997. And we show that to you to remind Americans how not only American presidents, but American citizens used to address the issue of true self-government, not false democracy, which is really fascism with a democratic face. And also, tomorrow marks the 4th anniversary of the passing of Lyndon LaRouche. He founded the Executive Intelligence Review magazine, which has existed for 49 years, publishing 50 weeks a year. And tomorrow, we will start a 6+ hours of Lyndon LaRouche's speeches and ideas. And that will start at noon. And so now we're going to go to our two main speakers, who I will bring them both up here, just so that, there they are. I will bring them both up here. We will be beginning with Harley Schlanger, and then we will go down to Mike Robinson. So, Harley, what do you have for me today?
Well, Jose, good to see you, and glad to see you put up that collage, because it does give people a sense of what it takes to break through the psychological warfare that's being run against the people in the Western world, in the transatlantic, Europe, and the United States. And some people ask, why are these kinds of interventions necessary? It's because you live under a psychological warfare bubble, one that's designed to silence debate, to promote lies. Look at the example of the treatment of Julian Assange to get a sense of how they hate to have their crimes exposed. So what we're trying to give people is the courage to speak out, to overcome fear. And a part of that requires that you know what's going on in the world, what the events are, and how they are being shaped. Who are the bad guys? What's the potential to outflank them? And I'm going to give you a report on some of the developments in the last 7 to 10 days that we'll take up in the course of the discussion with Mike and me. Mike, of course, is from the UK column, and he'll give us some views of what he's seeing from the United Kingdom. But let me start with these breaking developments. And the first, in line with what Jose just showed you, is our role in shaping the fight, to expose the danger, which most people don't want to face, the danger that we could end up in a nuclear war as part of this World War III deployment, as well as the fascist economic policy, the Malthusian depopulation policy of the Great Reset, but also to present the alternatives. Now, one thing that Lyndon LaRouche always stated and always insisted on is that the first place to look to get a bead on what's behind the developments is what's coming out of the City of London and its various networks that they run, and the crusade they have to maintain their empire in whatever form. Now, many people either know nothing about this or ignore it, but the worst are those who play along with it, play into it by saying, oh, LaRouche is crazy, he blames the British for everything. Let me make a point here. We're not blaming the people of England. We're blaming the British aristocracy, the oligarchy, the City of London, who have played a role in shaping world politics for the last 200 to 300 years. And Americans should remember that's who we fought against to achieve our independence. But people say LaRouche is crazy. The empire is long dead. This is conspiracy theory. Now, the reality is that there's an increasing recognition in the world that LaRouche was right, and that this fight against the unipolar order, or the rules-based order, which is emerging, is being shaped in many ways along the lines that Lyndon LaRouche laid out over the last 50 years, which you just saw in that speech from 1997. And this comes to the important role today played by the founder of the Schiller Institute and its chairwoman, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga's at the center of the rejection of the unipolar world and the emergence of the global South, the former non-aligned countries, the former colonies that know very well the nature of evil coming from London and its allies. And they are very much open to this question of a new strategic and economic development architecture, which Mrs. LaRouche has championed in the tradition of her husband's fight. Now, for those of you who don't know this, Helga is constantly in the Chinese media and presenting her analysis. She recently was involved in Nations of the Non-Aligned Movement, commemorating the importance of that from the late 1950s and its reemergence today. On this topic, she gave a speech this last week at the Sorbonne University in Paris. She did an interview 2 days ago with Dotcom, in which the topic was building a peace movement, not just to stop nuclear war, but based on how to build a durable peace along the principles that she laid out in the 10 fundamental principles that should be behind any negotiations to put an end to the Ukraine war. There was the interview with Garland Nixon. You just saw a section of that. And she's intervened in Germany with a very powerful statement talking about the importance of the Seymour Hersh article, which we'll get to in just a moment. But she called for the Bundestag to do a full investigation. And there are some voices coming out in Germany that are saying this must be investigated, from the so-called left, the so-called right. In the meantime, Chancellor Scholz and his party coalition, the Greens and the FDP, are trying to pretend that nothing was said about this, trying to pretend that the destruction of the availability of cheap gas for Germany, done, as Hersh says, by the United States, is not a big deal. And so the suffering of the German people as a result of this is being silenced by Scholz saying, don't worry, we'll be okay, and let's keep fighting for Ukraine. Now, in the meantime, one other thing you should know about Mrs. LaRouche: she remains the #1 name on the list of the Committee to Combat Disinformation, which is nominally a Ukrainian organization, but is largely directed by NATO. And anyone who disagrees with the idea of continuing to provide arms to Ukraine and to fight this war is called a Putin mouthpiece, an information terrorist. I should tell you, just in the interest of full disclosure, that I'm also on that list, along with people such as Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, and others. Now, let's start with the Seymour Hersh article, which hopefully some of you have seen. It's not very much publicized in the mainstream media. But what Hersh wrote about is, what he says is, the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, Hersh, if you don't know him, is one of the most celebrated investigative journalists. He's now 85 years old. His career goes back to the exposés he did of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in the late 1960s. He was also one of the people who exposed the Abu Ghraib torture center that was run by the U.S. in Iraq. He's broken many stories over the years. He's considered an authoritative investigative journalist. And what he reports is that the U.S. blew up the pipelines, that Biden gave the green light, that there was a team set up under National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which included the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the State Department, the Treasury Department, with aid from Denmark and Norway, and that they used the June 2022 Balt Ops 22 military exercise to send Navy divers who had been trained for this purpose into the sea where the pipelines were to place C4 explosives on the pipelines. And he said the military exercise was used as a cover for this. Now, he makes an interesting point. There were some who said blow it up right away, but the argument was made, according to his source, that that would be too obvious if it occurred right at the time of the Balt Ops 22. So they waited until September 26th, and then the detonation was triggered by something dropped from the air. Now, this is a very detailed article, and the people, it's interesting, people who are saying, well, he only has one anonymous source. How many times was an anonymous source cited to justify the lies of Russiagate. But in the case of Hirsch, here you have everything lines up according to the chronology that he gives. And what it really demonstrates is the evil state of mind behind people who would do this. That you have an obsessed war faction, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called them, that not only accepts the destruction of necessary infrastructure, but is willing to risk triggering a nuclear world war to defend their position in the world, to defend their unipolar order. So the Hirsch article is extremely important and is actually the starting point for getting at this question of what's involved in this Ukraine war. To what extent are they willing to go? Now, the second development I want to point to, and Mike will have something on this, a report on this, was the trip by Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to European capitals. He went to London, and Mike will give you an update on that. He then went to the Élysée Palace in Paris, where he met with Schulz and Macron. Then he went to the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and his message was the same each time. We're fighting for European values. We're waging your fight. You must give us more weapons and more material. Now, I think this is a sign of desperation. The war is not going well for Ukraine. It's just a terrible loss of lives and destruction. But instead of looking for negotiations, since NATO is supposedly dedicated to keeping the peace, why not have a diplomatic solution? No, instead they're insisting on more Ukrainians dying and more Russians dying. For what purpose? To degrade and weaken the Russian army as a prelude to dismantling Russia and grabbing its natural resources. That's what Zelensky represents. Whether he knows it or not, he's a puppet for those interests. The same interests which have been dismantling the Ukrainian economy and handing it over to corporate cartels such as the grain cartels, to BlackRock, to Vanguard, Continental, Cargill, and the other grain cartels. The best land in Ukraine is being given to the grain cartels as part of a privatization policy. So, and by the way, is the European way of life freezing in the dark? Because that's what's happening in some parts of Europe where people can no longer afford to pay for electricity because of the sanction policy. Is it not to negotiate for peace? Is that the European way of life that Zelensky's defending? And as Mike will probably report, we see a number of people in Britain advocating the attack on Crimea. That's why Zelensky is calling for long-range precision missiles so that they can start hitting Crimea as an aim to take that back. What the Rusi think tank calls the Crimean Missile Crisis. Tobias Ellwood, a leading anti-Russian figure, the head of the Defense Committee of the House of Commons, has been calling for direct intervention by the United Kingdom in the war, although he also admits that the British Army is unprepared in terms of equipment and logistics to do anything to last more than 2 weeks. So you see the craziness behind this. Now let's take the next development, the Chinese spy balloon fiasco. And I just wrote an article on this where I went through some of the details. You know, here we see something that, unless you know the context, it doesn't make sense. The idea that the Chinese would send a large balloon that's visible over U.S. airspace intentionally to spy, there's something more to this, and that's why the context is so important. You have the calls for war with China. General Minahan, the most recent, saying, we'll be at war by 2025. He said, I hope that doesn't happen, but my gut tells me it is. And he sent out a memo to the 50,000 airmen who serve under him to tell them to be prepared for this war. You have the Rand report, which said, look, we got to get the Ukraine war over. It's dangerous, it's risky, it could lead to nuclear war, but we've got to use the time now to prepare for war with China. So the idea of a war with China is on the agenda. Now, Blinken was scheduled to go to China to meet with top Chinese leaders. That was canceled when this balloon was spotted. And you had Republicans jumping up and down. Why aren't we shooting down this balloon? Then after it was shot down, they all were exulting about the great power of the U.S. military, that we could send up a fighter jet and shoot down a balloon. Now, even more crazy was the comments they were making. This was a threat to our sovereignty. That's what Biden said at his State of the Union address. And the bipartisan support for the war with China is something that ought to make every single person in the United States get on the phone immediately, send letters, get out on the streets on February 19th to stop this war machine before we end up in a two-front war which will go nuclear. Now, the next development I just want to reference is the aftermath of the earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria. And in particular, the fact that the U.S. government has continued to keep sanctions on the government of Syria, arguing that Assad is a brutal dictator, that we should not support him or help him in any way. The same idea that led the United States to provide arms, weapons, and training to ISIS and Al-Qaeda to carry out a regime change against President Assad and his government. Now, that's a reality. That's true. That's what the U.S. was doing. General Flynn, from his position at Defense Intelligence Agency, reported on that. The U.S. military was engaged, including weapon shipments through Benghazi to the Syrian terrorists. And the Assad government fought them and defended Syrian sovereignty, and then was helped by the Russians to push back the terrorists, and also helped by the Iranians. And what was the line coming from Britain in particular? Assad is gassing his own people. This turns out to be absolute lies. It's been exposed repeatedly, including by the Gray Zone and Max Blumenthal and others, as a fraud, as a hoax. The so-called white helmets are part of the British propaganda arm of the BBC and the British intelligence, the ones who are the authors of the idea of overthrowing Assad and his government. But because of those lies, including the so-called Caesar photos, the photos that were sneaked out of the country of bodies, many of which were people who were killed by the terrorists, but were supposedly victims of Assad's terror, that was used to escalate the sanctions, the so-called Caesar sanctions. And so at the point at which you have this horrible tragedy, this earthquake that hit, especially the city of Aleppo, the second largest city of Syria, a city which is still recovering from the damages inflicted upon it by the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra networks. The U.S. State Department reaffirmed that it will continue the sanctions against Syria. That is no aid. Now, the Treasury announced a couple of days ago they were going to lift some of the sanctions. That's not adequate. There's no reason for these sanctions to be continued except the intention to overthrow another government, which is apparently the one thing that the war hawks in both parties intend to continue to do, to impose the continuation of the unipolar order. So this is something that people can bring up between now and February 19th and the march in Washington. Contact your congressman. Children are dying, not just in Syria, but sanctions are killing children still in Afghanistan, where there's mass starvation underway because we stole their money. There are children dying in Yemen. The Libyan situation continues to be chaotic because of the US-NATO attacks on that country. So this is the unipolar order, the so-called rules-based order, which starves children, withholds medicine, withholds necessary funds for the purposes of regime change. And that's the same unipolar order that continues to insist on providing funds to put more weapons in the hands of Ukrainians to continue the fight to degrade Russia. Now, the final breaking story I want to call to your attention is a long article in the Columbia Journalism Review, which is one of the most important publications of this sort. The Columbia School of Journalism provides many, many graduates for the media and others. It's an article by Jeff Gerth, a former New York Times investigative reporter. In fact, I think he was at the New York Times for 27 years. And it was published January 30th, and it's called The Press versus the President. It's a detailed account of the lies, consistent lies in the media about Russiagate. Lies that are still heard in the media today. And he focuses in particular on his old newspaper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. Now, why is this so important? Well, these are the same media sources, part of this corporate cartel, the blob, as LaRouche used to call it, that's creating or that's controlling the environment so that there's only one message that gets out, which is the message of the unipolar order. Gerth dissects it with interviews, with material. A lot of this material has been reported before. Among the people who've reported it have been people such as Aaron Mate and the Gray Zone, but we've covered enormous amounts of this in the Executive Intelligence Review. Evidence of the fraud of the Steele report, the Clinton campaign's use of this, the fact that Bill Binney, the former technical director of the National Security Agency, exposed that there never was a Russian hack of the DNC and the Clinton campaign computers. In fact, the head of the cyber network, the cybersecurity network of the Democratic Party, told a congressional hearing that there was no evidence of an external taking of material, hacking of material from the DNC computers. This is the person of the cybersecurity agency that had been cited previously as saying that it was a Russian hack and that it was Assange got the hack from the Russians, and that's what Russiagate was about. It's all a fabrication, as we've said from the beginning. And Gerth's article is a good start towards exposing this. Now, if you put these situations I've just put together as a whole, what you can see is that we're at a point where the truth is beginning to emerge. When you have the veteran journalist of Seymour Hersh exposing the Nord Stream pipelines being blown up by the United States, when you have Gerth, a celebrated New York Times reporter, exposing his own paper as a consistent liar and fabricator. I mean, one of the things Gerth says is that what happened repeatedly was someone would cite an anonymous source, and next thing you know, everybody would refer back to that, and the next thing you know, that was considered the truth, and the fact checkers would reject anyone who didn't stick to that story. So we're seeing a break. This is something we've been fighting for. This is something that you saw Jose and his collaborators intervening in the face of Chuck Schumer and AOC. This is what Mrs. LaRouche has been fighting for in every single webcast and podcast and interview that she does. You know, this is what I put up every single day in my 5 days a week, I should say, in my daily update, where we update you on what's actually happening. So the point is that people can know the truth. And knowing the truth gives you a power, especially when you're going up against known liars. And now we're seeing the liars being exposed. And so I would encourage you, subscribe to the Executive Intelligence Review, sign up for our daily updates, be a part of our movement, join us on February 19th in Washington, because what's at stake here is the future of the human race. And that future is in the hands of many, many people who are aware there's something wrong, but have been content to go along with it, either because they don't think you can succeed or because they've been discouraged by the lies and the censorship. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who will give us some insights as to what's been going on in the United Kingdom that's part of this whole war process. Mike?
Thank you, Harley. Right, I'm just going to say that, you mentioned early on in your presentation, you talked about the City of London, its influence in the world. I think that it is the case that if Zelensky's visit, because we were very privileged to have Zelensky visiting us on Wednesday this week in the UK, if Zelensky's visit demonstrated one thing, it is that the British government, the British political system, and the British media is completely captured by that ideology, that oligarchy. Let's use that word. So here he is. He got off the plane, I believe at Stansted Airport, and was immediately hugged by Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. They couldn't keep their hands off each other. When they finally extracted their tongues, they headed off to Parliament. Parliament, the House of Commons, was suspended at 10:30 on Wednesday, and they all filed into Westminster Hall, the Commons and the Lords together, to give a standing ovation for a significant amount of time to no dissenting voices, it seems, within Parliament at the moment. I'm just going to show a short clip from Zelensky's speech here, because he gave a presentation during it, really highlighting the reason he was there, which of course, as Harley's already mentioned, was for long-range missiles and for fast jets. Now, it's interesting that I'm hearing from friends we have in Poland that people are becoming increasingly disenchanted in Poland with Zelensky's delivery. At the beginning, he was asking very nicely, please give us support. Now he's demanding, but he was in London indeed demanding, but he had a present for Parliament.
Because they are so few, they are so precious, that we, the servants of our kings, do everything possible and impossible to make the world provide us with modern planes to empower and protect pilots who will be protecting us. And I am proud of our Air Force. And I brought a present from them to you, Great Britain. Yes, please, open please. Yes. Yes. To the speaker. Yes, speaker. Hello. And I will explain. It's the helmet of a real Ukrainian pilot. He is one of our most successful aces, and he's one of our kings.
So you saw the size of the audience. That was the entire House of Commons, which is 650 MPs plus whatever number of Lords were there as well. Well, the man who received the helmet from Zelensky was Lindsay Hoyle, who's the Speaker of the House of Commons. Now, he's supposed to be entirely neutral politically, but as we'll see in a second, he's far from it. But it was a white helmet, of course. Harley's mentioned the white helmet's no relation, I think, in this case, although symbolically it does remind us of the ghost of Kiev, if you remember back a year, who was apparently shooting down or doing so much good work for the Ukrainians back at the beginning. But unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they eventually had to admit that the ghost, in fact, never existed. So Lindsay Hoyle, as I say, the Speaker of the House, supposedly neutral politically. He was interviewed after Zelensky's speech by Julia Hartley-Brewer, who is a presenter on Talk TV. We'll hear her name later on in this presentation, but she had a question for Lindsay Hoyle. Let's just have a listen to this.
I'm always very worried when, even though I think that we should provide those jets, even though I believe we should have been giving more help and we should give more help, and that the risk of not giving help is greater, I'm always very worried when we have unanimity in Parliament. We saw that over the Iraq War. I remember Parliament is all united and saying, and Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak saying we need to speak with one voice. We don't have that debate. Do you not worry about that as the Speaker of the Commons?
Well, I would say we did have that debate. There is a difference here. This is Europe. This is on our doorstep. This is where the British people have opened the doors. They have welcomed and supported the plight of Ukraine. This is about the invasion of a sovereign territory. This is about Europe. Who is next? This is a challenge to the NATO borders. But of course, as you well know, Julie, as Speaker of the House, I hold my neutrality. Yep. My neutrality is there to ensure, which we did. We have had many debates on Ukraine, and that is the key to it. And may we continue to do that.
Which, of course, is complete nonsense, because they've had many debates in inverted commas, but when everybody's speaking with the same voice, of course, there is no debate at all. But as you heard from Julia Hartley-Brewer there, the media absolutely captured as well, banging the war drums in the UK. There are no dissenting voices in the mainstream press whatsoever. And just to reinforce that, this little tweet was pushed out by Bloomberg during the week, and highlighting the fact that a BBC reporter, well, let's have a look at what happened.
Mr. President, I would really like to hug you, but I'm not allowed. Why not? Please, do give me a hug, you know.
Security. So politicians, the media, all on the same side in this respect, and no option for any dissenting voices in the mainstream whatsoever. Now, Zelensky gave a white helmet to Lindsay Hoyle, but later on in the day, they had their little PR stunt by wearing some green helmets. So there's Zelensky and Rishi Sunak heading off to look at some fast jets. They thought they needed to wear some helmets if they were going near those jets. This was a massive PR exercise in the UK to promote the idea of Britain sending the jets. And well, whose voice was heard? Well, of course, Boris Johnson's. And he's basically saying, we've got to give Ukraine all the UK's jets, all the UK's tanks. It's time to give the Ukrainians the extra equipment they need to defeat Putin and restore peace to Ukraine. That means longer range missiles and artillery. It means more tanks. It means planes. We have more than 100 Typhoon jets, otherwise known as the Eurofighter. We have more than 100 Challenger 2 tanks. The best single use for any of these items is to deploy them now for the protection of the Ukrainians, not least because that's how we guarantee our own long-term security. The insanity of this is off the charts. They are proposing that to bring Ukrainian jet pilots to the UK for 2 weeks training on the Typhoon jets, and that's going to be sufficient. Now, I can't remember when I think it was Romania transitioned from MiG fighters to Western fighters. I can't remember whether they were F-16s or Typhoons. It took them a year to complete that transition, and they're expecting Ukraine to do that in 2 weeks. Of course, that's nonsense. It's at the very, very least, it's going to require huge quantities of British personnel on the ground in Ukraine to support engineering staff and so on, to support any deployment of UK fighters, should that eventually be made. Now, the Russian response to this was quite clear. This was a statement from the Russian embassy in London, talking about the hasty visit by the Ukrainian commander-in-chief to the UK capital. But this was the key quote. Zelensky's fundraising event in London would, of course, have been incomplete without begging for more weapons that Kiev has long ceased to pretend are merely defensive in nature, this time Western fighter jets. Given that NATO artillery systems have been repeatedly used by Kiev warmongers to shell peaceful cities in the Donbass, hardly any doubts remain that Western jets, should they be provided, would also be used in air raids against residential areas of the DPR, LPR, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions that have come under Russian protection. We would like to remind London, in the event of such a scenario, the death toll of yet another round of escalation as well as its military political consequences for the European continent and the whole world, will be on the United Kingdom's hands. And I have to admit, it is very hard to argue with that. Now, as I say, the issue of dissenting voices being heard is one which is increasingly problematic. Over in recent or in past presentations on this format, I've presented the way that the UK government, the mechanisms the UK government has to try to control the narrative in the UK and globally, in fact. And one of those mechanisms is 77 Brigade. Now, Harley mentioned Tobias Ellwood earlier, and he is the chair of the Defence Select Committee, and he's also obviously a serving MP, but he's also a reservist in 77 Brigade, an absolute Russiaphobe. He Lieutenant Colonel in 77 Brigade, but anyway, 77 Brigade was brought up in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's Questions also on Wednesday. So let's just have a quick listen to what was said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Big Brother Watch recently released a report into unaccountable government bodies such as the Counter Disinformation Unit, the Rapid Response Unit and the British Army's 77th Brigade. We're seeing huge swathes of public money being spent recording political dissent on social media under the guise of tackling misinformation. Politicians, including myself, the Leader of the Opposition, academics, activists and journalists, and even members of public have been subjected to monitoring by Whitehall officials. This at the same time as we're waiting for the reporting of the Pitchford inquiry into questionable state surveillance on campaigns like the Stephen Lawrence campaign. So can the Prime Minister tell us how much public money is spent on these units and whether he thinks it's a justifiable thing to do in our democracy to spend public money in this manner? And could you also update the House on the progress of the Pitchford inquiry?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to get back to the Honourable Lady on the Pitchford inquiry and indeed to give her an exact figure. But in general, I think certainly I on this side of the House believe very strongly in free speech and will make sure that we continue to protect it wherever we can.
Well, that's got to be one of the most pathetic answers to some very specific questions. So let's just have a look at what the Labour MP there was talking about. This is the tweet that went out from Big Brother Watch on January the 29th. Today we expose the hashtag Ministry of Truth. Secretive government units and the British Army have been spying on the public, academics, journalists, human rights campaigners and MPs in the UK under the guise of combating misinformation. So Big Brother Watch, an NGO in the UK, these are their key findings, that Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, Conservative MPs David Davis and Chris Green, high-profile academics from the University of London and the University of Oxford and University College London, and journalists including Peter Hitchens and Julia Hartley-Brewer, who we heard from earlier, all had comments critical of the government analysed by anti-misinformation units. Targeted speech included public criticism of the government's pandemic response, particularly lockdown modelling and vaccine passports, as well as journalist criticism of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and MPs' criticism of NATO. Soldiers from the Army's 77th Brigade, tasked with non-lethal psychological warfare, collected tweets from British citizens posting about COVID-19 and passed them to central government, despite claiming operations were directed strictly overseas. They also published some of the names that you will have heard me talk about over the last couple of years on this programme. They've labelled it the Ministry of Truth, including the Counter Disinformation Unit, the Rapid Response Unit, the Research Intelligence Communications Unit, Government Information Cell, and so on. So I'll just show you a couple of points here. So we have a section on the UK Column website on this. It's at ukcolumn.org/censored. And just one of the items on the timeline that we have there, Theresa May establishes the Rapid Response Unit inside the Cabinet Office, also known as the Fake News Unit. The Rapid Response Unit was given an initial 6 months funding. It brings together a team of analysts, data scientists and media and digital experts armed with cutting-edge software to work around the clock to monitor online breaking news stories and social media discussion, with a view to countering any dissent on social media, including asking Twitter, Facebook and other social media organisations to take content down. Now, I wrote a couple of articles on this over the years. One was this one, the British military information war waged on their own population. That was back in 2020. And then we've got Beyond Integrity Initiative, the scale of UK Gov counter disinformation, published in February 2019. This really was the graphic that I produced to sort of show the scale of it, because it is and has been linked in with the various intelligence agencies. We have the Rapid Response Unit, the National Security Communications Team, 77th Brigade, 13 Signals, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Fake News Unit, and the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse. And that last one is particularly insidious because what this effectively is, just to remind you, is effectively a blacklist of activists, journalists, members of the public who are making freedom of information requests in order to get certain types of information. And if a freedom of information request goes into any government agency from somebody on that list, instead of the government agency's freedom of information team answering that question directly, it gets sent to the Cabinet Office, to the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse, where it's processed in a very special way. So wanted to highlight how far and this is going. It's getting some mainstream coverage now because this latest intervention from Big Brother Watch is more palatable to mainstream media than the work we're doing, but nonetheless, at least it's getting some coverage. Now, the other thing that Harley asked me to sort of mention today is the issue of Tory party, Conservative Party corruption and sleaze, particularly around Boris Johnson. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through a quick timeline of the major events that took place while Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and leading up to one which is currently ongoing. So let's start off in May 2020. So if we put this on screen, so initially, if you remember, people may remember that one of Boris Johnson's main aides at the time was a guy called Dominic Cummings. Unfortunately, he, at least in May 2020, initially refused to resign or apologise because he was breaching lockdown rules. That became public, and it was quite embarrassing for the Johnson government, but he refused at that time to resign. He eventually was forced to resign. Then in July 2020, we had Tory MP Charlie Elphicke guilty of sexual assault. He was guilty of 3 counts of sexual assault against 2 women, and there was more. Then in July 2021, Rob Roberts here, another Conservative MP, he had made significant, repeated, unwanted sexual advances to a former member of staff. Then who do we have? Let's see. Oh yes, Boris Johnson decided to spend £112,000 on refurbishing the flat that he lives in as Prime Minister in Downing Street, in number 10 Downing Street. Now the idea is that the flat is a personal residence, and so each new MP is supposed to, if they want to redecorate, it's at their own expense. But he wasn't quite clear how he was going to pay for this, and that was asking questions. We'll come back to this issue in a second. Then let's see, where are we? July 2021. Well, this article was published in June. So Matt Hancock, who had been the health secretary at the time, at the peak of COVID lockdown, unfortunately had to resign because he had been breaking social distance guidance by having an affair, which was inappropriate and certainly against the rules that he was supposed to be implementing at the time. This was a bit embarrassing, so he had to go. Then Boris Johnson, well, he was cleared over a holiday to Mystique, but he was basically accused of lying about the whole situation, so that was a bit unfortunate for him. Then we had Owen Paterson, another Tory MP, and well, he was breaking the lobbying rules. So an egregious breach of lobbying rules is how it was described. So he was getting paid £100,000 a year to allow certain organisations to lobby in Parliament. Then we had more sexual improprieties. Andrew Griffiths raped and physically abused his MP wife in December 2021. Then we had the top civil servant appointed by Boris Johnson, Simon Case. He had been put in charge of investigating the breaches of lockdown rules, of COVID-19 lockdown rules, but then it was discovered that he had actually held a party inside his office during lockdown rules, and so he had breached the lockdown rules himself, so he had to resign from heading up the investigation. Okay. And then we had, another corruption after great exhibition. Text emerges. So this is this was about Boris Johnson's £112,000 makeover of his flat because he had raised that money in pretty inappropriate ways. But anyway, then we come on to this. Somerton and Frome MP David Warburton suspended this time what was sexual harassment and cocaine use. Yes, okay, and it goes on. Imran Ahmed Khan, former Tory MP, sentenced to 18 months in prison for sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy. You start to see a pattern here. And then we've got Neil Parish, another Tory MP, had to resign in May 2022 because he'd been watching pornography in the House of Commons. It's just incredible how far this goes. And then another allegation of rape. This time the Tory MP was not mentioned. This is May 2022. And that Tory MP still hasn't been named, so we don't know who that is. Then we had the Partygate scandal, which is what resulted in Boris Johnson losing his job as Prime Minister in the first place, because it's again the systematic breach of lockdown rules while everybody else was having to obey them. So his position was untenable. Sue Gray in May published her report, which was considered damning, and so he was eventually pushed out. And then finally, here we have the Tory whip. Now, the whip is the guy who's supposed to make sure that Tories behave themselves in Parliament. This is Chris Pincher, and this is more sexual impropriety because he had apparently drunkenly groped two men at a private club, and this became public. Now, so what's the point here? Well, the thing is, particularly with respect to, I mean, we're talking I was mentioning at the beginning of the program that politics is absolutely captured by certain interests. But the question is, how is it captured? And particularly with the sexual impropriety, well, let me just give you a clue as to what's going on here. This is a short excerpt from an interview that the BBC did a number of years ago with a former Tory whip, a guy called Tim Fortescue. He was a whip during the Ted Heath government. This is what he had to say.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth. They'd say, no, I'm in a jam. Can you help? It might be debt. It might be scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
He'll do as we ask forevermore. That, I think, explains quite a lot. But then the final corruption scandal is still ongoing, because it turns out that Boris Johnson, while he was still Prime Minister, was in a bit of financial difficulties. He needed to raise a small amount of about £800,000. And this man, Richard Sharp, is currently accused of helping him raise that money. But the problem was that no sooner had Richard Sharp helped Boris Johnson raise that money, but Richard Sharp was given the job of chairman of the BBC. Now, Richard Sharp himself is a Tory donor. He's given more than £400,000 to the Conservative Party over the years. And he has admitted that he introduced a friend of his, in fact, a guy called Sam Blythe, who is actually a cousin of Boris Johnson. So I'm not quite sure exactly how this worked, but nonetheless, he made the connection. And so Boris Johnson was able to raise the money in order to, whatever he needed it for. Maybe it was to pay back some of the money for the refurbishment of the flat. I don't know. Now, the question I just want to end with here is, would we be any better with a Labour government? And, well, maybe this gives us a clue. This is during an interview. This is Sir Keir Starmer, first of all, who's currently the leader of the Labour Party, and therefore, if the Labour Party were to win the next general election, he would become Prime Minister. So just think about what kind of Prime Minister he would make. This little interview excerpt is from the recent World Economic Forum conference at Davos. Just have a listen to this.
Go. You've got a lot to do, but we'll end on a quick fire because obviously we wouldn't be a podcast without a quick fire. So let us just ask you quickly. You have to choose now between Davos or Westminster.
Davos.
Why?
Because Westminster is too constrained, and it's closed, and we're not having meaning. Once you get out of Westminster, whether it's Davos or anywhere else, you actually engage with people that you can see working with in the future. Westminster is just a tribal shouting place.
I mean, he's not wrong about Westminster being a tribal shouting place, but this is a potential future Prime Minister effectively saying that really the rules of democracy aren't for him. He really wants to be working with the folks at Davos. That's a much better platform for him. And so maybe that gives us a clue as to the thinking, and certainly demonstrates the fact that there is no side of politics in the UK at the moment which isn't working towards this globalist agenda and so on. Helga in her, I'm just going to leave everybody with this one, but Helga in her interview earlier mentioned Liz Truss's comments with respect to the Nord Stream pipeline. It's done, is what she said, apparently. So we can have another discussion about that in a second, no doubt. But that's what I've got for you today.
Well, first of all, if you're just tuning in, you just witnessed a very stark presentation that things in the UK are not any better than they are here in the US. I'm at least the royal family would never engage in such, scandalous politics. Just they have poise and discipline. Anyway, I have my own comments, but Harley, do you want to take a minute to respond?
Well, I think, Mike, I appreciate what you presented, and I think it's important because what the context for this is that Boris Johnson and the City of London is pushing the war in Ukraine because of their desire to destroy Russia. And in the process, they're destroying their own country. I mean, as this is going on, you have the economy in a complete spiral downward in the United Kingdom. You have strikes, you have austerity, people can't afford to pay for their homes, they have long waits from the National Health Service. And I think the important thing here is that you have people like Boris Johnson and Sunak, who, as far as I understand, has a popularity rating that's now challenging where Liz Truss was before she had to resign. So here you have a government that's completely incompetent, or if it's competent in destroying its own country for the sake of the global policy. So I think this gives people a sense of what we're dealing with, an absolute immoral evil that is committed to policies that could lead to World War III and nuclear war. And for what? For their own pleasure, their own power. So I think this is quite significant for people to see. You could do something similar for the United States in terms of the bipartisan commitment to this war. But at this point, as we've always emphasized, the lead has come from the United Kingdom. The first tanks were promised by the United Kingdom. The fighter jets were promised by the United Kingdom. The attack on Crimea was put forward by the Royal United Services Institute and the Warhawks in the British defense sector. The idea of NATO directly engaging in the war in Ukraine comes from British leaders. So these are the people who are shaping U.S. policy. And I think Americans should think about that when they decide whether they want to participate in this February 19th march and demonstration.
Harley, I just wanted to say that, when Tobias Ellwood, we mentioned Tobias Ellwood a couple of times so far, when he was agitating for the tanks, and he was on the media every day for about 2 weeks agitating for the tanks, and his point was, if Britain leads, the rest will follow. And he was completely open about that in the mainstream press, where Britain leads, the rest will follow. And this is what they're going to try to do with the fighter jets as well.
Mike, let me ask you, from what I understand, Sunak's popularity is extremely low. He's seen as somewhat of a caretaker. Does he have much more time as prime minister? Are they going to put a head of lettuce in a shop that represents the time that he has, the way they did with Liz Truss?
Well, there's quite a bit of agitation going on inside the Tory party. So Liz Truss is certainly agitating against Sunak. Boris is certainly agitating against Sunak because both of those want their jobs back. Liz had it for the shortest time in history, but she wants another go. Boris wants another go. So there's certainly a bit of internal strife within the Tory party. But the problem is, Harley, as you know, I'm suggesting about Keir Starmer, there's nothing that grabs people's attention in any of the other parties. So it's Parliament circling the drain as far as I can see.
Well, and part of it is theater, because essentially behind the scenes, while all of this is going on in public, behind the scenes, it's the City of London, it's the House of Lords, the bankers, the corporate cartels which are making the policy, and people like Johnson and others who are seen as larger-than-life figures are puppets, just like Zelensky.
Well, the only thing that Boris Johnson had going for him was that, to a lot of people, his affable, sort of clownish behaviour was attractive, and he could sell the policies. Sunak is unable to sell the policies, but then Keir Starmer is also unable to sell the policies, but they're still pursuing the policies because there's within the House of Commons there's not a dissenting MP as far as I can see, and if they are there, they're too scared to speak out publicly.
Well, instead of just piling on the United Kingdom war, we should point out we have a debt ceiling crisis facing the U.S. Congress. We have record 31 trillion debt. We have no way of paying it. We have no solutions being put forward except the green policy of Biden and austerity from the Republicans. So this represents a crisis of all the systems which are behind the unipolar order. And this is why we're seeing a rebellion from the global south, because as Modi said the other day, India needs fossil fuels. As we're hearing from Brazil, as we're hearing from South Africa, from Nigeria, Algeria, Indonesia, development is the basis for peace. And instead, what we're getting from the so-called advanced sector is Malthusian green policy and war. And so I think that's why our voice has become so prominent among developing sector countries, because what Lyndon LaRouche represented going back to the 70s with his International Development Bank policy, his new Bretton Woods, his 4 laws of economy, the 4 power agreement, has always been this idea that economic development based on directing credit to the physical economy as opposed to allowing private banks to control the credit and spending policies. LaRouche's policies are gaining in recognition, including from one of the most prominent Russian economists, Sergei Glaziev. So I think this is the reason it's worth going through this, is to show people that behind the theater and everything else, you see a disastrous policy shaping up, and there is an alternative.
Just real quick before we have some questions, but we also have a statement, Harley, that I'd like for you to break down and react for us. Let me see if I can put this up here easily. So this was put out by the, This was put out by the Civil Rights Movement Solidarity, known as the BUSO, which is affiliated with Helga. And the statement goes, "Common good instead of war. We in Berlin know what peaceful reunification means, and that is exactly why Berlin must stand up for peace and development worldwide. The Ukraine conflict must not end in nuclear war. Negotiations bring peace, not weapons. We cannot do without gas and oil from Russia, an end to destructive sanctions. Berlin also finally needs a development boost, massive investments in the ailing infrastructure, roads, railways, and waterways. A modern maglev network can also finally bring us into the 21st century. Secure energy supply with nuclear energy and nuclear fusion. No poker game with nature for sun and wind. A modern healthcare system with well-paid nursing staff and thus thousands of productive jobs. Berlin must become a cultural, research, and industrial metropolis again. Let's revive our humanistic image of man and our great classical culture, because first come the people. Harley, can you break that down for us?
Well, I think it's actually pretty clear for most people. I mean, the importance is that this is from the political party of Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And what it's saying, I think, is what most Germans would agree with. If you took away the years of slander and attacks against the Busso and against Helga Zepp-LaRouche, if people just heard that as a program, they would agree. Because there's the power, the economic power, and the moral standing of Germany in the world in the post-war period was based on its economic development. And this goes back to the engineering and scientific tradition, the classical cultural tradition of Schiller, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, and so on, the science tradition of Einstein and Max Planck. This represents the real Germany. And this is what's been under attack by the British going back to the end of the 19th century and before that. But British geopolitics starts from the idea that there must be no collaboration between France, Germany, and Russia, and especially a connection between Eurasia and Europe. And Germany was at the center of that. And so Germany has been a target for many, many years of British geopolitics. Now, Germany prospered after the war, but it did so under the full control of NATO. And now what we're seeing, the question that many people in Germany are asking is, are we a sovereign nation? Do we have a right to do something for the good of the citizens? Or are we subject to the kind of sophistry and evil of the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who said, we're going to back Ukraine to the end, no matter what my German voters think. Now, how is that a sign of democracy? She doesn't care what the German voters think. She's made the decision. And she made the decision based on her relationship with Blinken and her British training. So the Busso statement, we're going to be circulating that. This is going to go along with Helga's statement on the importance of investigating the Seymour Hersh allegations that the U.S. Blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And the question of Germany is pivotal for Europe. If Germany were to break with the NATO policy, then you would see the same kind of tendency in France, in Italy, and other countries. The problematic part of Europe is the Eastern Europeans, who are very small for the most part, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, very small countries, but big mouths in their commitment to fight to destroy Russia. Finally, let me just say, Germany is being pushed in a course of rapid deindustrialization. The auto sector is under attack. The machine tool sector is under attack. Without cheap oil and energy, it's not going to survive. There's no way the industrial power and engineering power of Germany can be maintained with solar and wind. We see that in the United States as well. So our fight on this is to get back to real science and real culture, which starts with the idea that every human being has a right to a creative existence, to carry out the work of the Creator, to be a part of that continuous creation. And that's the message you find if you study the works of Schiller, this idea of the beautiful soul as opposed to a consumer. as opposed to a parasite. And so we're fighting for the soul of Germany, and that's what Helga has always done.
I have questions for the both of you. So I think what I'll do is I'll do the questions for Harley and then to you, Mike. So Harley, these are both. I'll combine these into one question just because I think you could probably handle it that way. These are questions from Ari. First one is: many countries are not against Russia as things stand. What are the chances of having UN meeting to come with a peace agreement or truce? And then secondly, they say, what are the economic projections this year for the EU versus the rest of the world, like Russia, China, India, the South?
Well, on the first one, there are some calls for negotiations. One of them was from the Vatican, from Pope Francis, who offered the Vatican as a venue for negotiations with no preconditions. And the Russians have said they would accept that. So far, the Ukrainians have refused. Then you have Lula, the president of Brazil, who, when he was meeting with Schultz, said, we need negotiations, we need a club of peace. And he talked about pulling together a different group, not the G20, but a group of nations that want peace. And in particular, he talked about Indonesia, India, and a few others, including Brazil and Argentina. And I think you could put Mexico in that group also. Whether it would be through the United Nations or not, look, the UN is a somewhat compromised body when it comes to these things. That's why we're seeing the emergence of new institutions like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. So I don't think that something like this will come through the United Nations. It should, but it's probably not going to. But there are other venues, and I think that's important. And it would be important for people to go on our website and look at the letter that we've drafted of support for the Pope's call. It's not support for the Pope or the Vatican. It's support for negotiations with the Vatican as a venue. Now, on the second question, look, you can always reconfigure statistics. The BBC ran a story a couple of days ago, and Mike may know more on this, but they said Britain narrowly escapes recession. And the argument they have is that recession is when you have 2 quarters in a row of negative growth. And they said there was 0 growth in the second quarter, but that's not negative, so therefore it's not a recession. Well, try and explain that to the people in England who can't afford to pay for electricity, can't afford to pay for food, for transportation, and so on. All of Europe is facing a significant contraction because the prices of energy are skyrocketing, the price of food is skyrocketed, transportation, medical care, availability of medical care, all of these things are in a crisis. And whatever they say with the various reports about the strength of the economy and so on, it's just not true. And all you have to do is walk through cities and you can see that. Just as if you walk through US cities, you'll see people living under bridges who can't afford the rents that they have to pay. So I think what we're seeing is an overall degradation of the economy throughout the European zone, with the expectation that once the war is over, they'll be able to rebuild, or that a defense buildup, a huge transfer of funds from physical economy into the defense sector will somehow trigger a recovery. It's not going to happen. And that's why it's so necessary to have a credit policy which takes into consideration LaRouche's 4 laws of regulation, of direct credit from the government to physical economic policy, infrastructure spending, and investment in science and technology, instead of the privatization, deregulation, and so on, which is the policy of the European Union. I think ultimately the European Union is a dead man walking, and it's still going, but I think this is something that's going to be a significant change when we can get to a new global development architecture.
Okay, thank you, Harley. Oh, were you going to respond to that, Mike? Or?
No, I was just going to echo what Harley said. The reality on the ground, the economic reality on the ground in the UK is horrendous, and it's one of the areas where it is most being felt is in the area of healthcare, and the UK is currently experiencing excess mortality, which is higher than anything that has ever been seen in any non-pandemic year, and is rapidly approaching the kind of levels that we're seeing at some of the peaks over the last 2 or 3 years. Really nobody is offering any accurate explanation for why that is. There are many reasons. Part of it is the fact that healthcare in this country was effectively hamstrung by policies that were put into place during the pandemic years, with beds being removed to make sure social distancing could take place in hospitals, but were then never replaced, with staff levels falling and so on. So a lot of the media coverage about nurses striking is talking about pay rises, but the main reason that nurses are striking is because they are saying that their working situation is not safe, that patient safety does not exist in British hospitals at the moment, and that seems to be one of the causes of this excess mortality. So we're seeing, the effects of the economic collapse in a very real way, not just in the fact that some people are having to make a choice between whether they heat their homes or feed their children, which is an age-old trope, but it's actually resulting in deaths and no response from government to try to resolve that issue at the moment.
Mike, we have a question for you. Roger Waters made the UN speech calling for a negotiated settlement of the war. He was then denounced by members of his own Pink Floyd band. In the post-war period, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was created, through which money was funneled to the artists, novelists, journalists, and writers of the NATO countries. Are we seeing a top-down control on all elements of life to suppress anyone that speaks out?
I think we absolutely are. I mean, if we think about Roger Waters hasn't been part of Pink Floyd for, 1990s or so, I think he left. So he hasn't been part of Pink Floyd for a long time. There's been a significant rift between him and David Gilmour for decades. And so that has certainly been exploited in this case for whatever reason. What the motivation was, of course, we're not entirely sure. But nonetheless, it has been exploited. We have seen over the last number of years, we have seen people in with a public presence being absolutely vilified for if they go against the mainstream narrative. I mean, everything, whether it be on whether we're discussing war or, for example, J.K. Rowling and her comments about trans issues, transsexual issues, and so on. Anybody that speaks out is jumped on by the mainstream press, by the various campaign groups and so on, and their careers are effectively ended. So, Roger Waters is in a fortunate position because he's had his career. He is worth a lot of money. He's probably too big to fail in the sense of a public personality. And so he can make these statements without any fear, really, although he has, of course, been. And what was interesting about the United Nations, and Harley might have something to say about this, but one of the things I thought was interesting about his UN presentation was, he began by saying, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was illegal and it should be condemned. And then he went on to say, but of course, Russia did not act without provocation, and the provocateurs should also be condemned. But the mainstream press, when they attacked him, ignored the Russia comment and merely it's almost like it didn't happen, and focused on the provocateur statement. So, that was a perfect example of the way that the mainstream press is attacking people. But I think absolutely it is a top-down attack on anybody that attempts to offer any kind of dissenting or counter narrative to whatever the mainstream narrative is.
Harley, did you want to add on to that?
Well, I think we can look at, besides the arts, look at the sciences. If you are a scientist, and a real scientist who looks at the climate as an effect that's not just from capture of gases inside the atmosphere, but look at the universe as a whole. You look at solar radiation, you look at the placement of our solar system in the broader galaxy, and in you take a look at the whole picture. If you do that, you're called a climate denier. And the idea that, I live in northern Germany now. We've had pretty cold summers the last couple of years, and yet the media, including in Berlin, keeps saying these have been the hottest summers on record. Now, the attempt to suppress debate is the most important thing. There have been aspects of climate change that's always been present. But the idea that there's only one answer, it's the same thing with economics. The idea of the unipolar order is there's one economic policy that works. The Cold War was won, according to the neoconservatives and the grouping that imposes the unipolar order. It was won because of the deregulation, privatization, financialization, and so on. And they ignore the fact that it's built up an incredible volume of debt which can never be paid. And to pay it, people die. Now, if you say that, you're considered some kind of troglodyte who doesn't understand the importance of modern finance. So in virtually every field, there's a kind of, it goes beyond political correctness. It's dogmatism. It makes the Inquisition from the 15th century look like a picnic. People get driven out of universities, grants get canceled, tenure is lost. And you look at the fact that someone like Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who's fighting for peace and global development, is called an information terrorist. So these are tough times, and it does take courage to stand up to this. But in the case of someone like Roger Waters, in the case of the people who are going to be participating in our conference, in the march, I should say, on February 19th, they're coming under attack. Jackson Hinkle is coming under attack. Scott Ritter is coming under attack. And these are attempts to blunt the message and stop the debate. And that's what should be focused on. The people can answer for the things they're being charged with. But what you find is you're not allowed to rebut the charges. And this is where you see the disgusting nature of this control. And it's aimed at one thing, which is stifling debate, silencing different opinions. And, this is probably the most dangerous aspect of this unipolar order. And I think this is really you have someone like what Mike Robinson is doing with the UK column. They're exposing the people who do this. That's what we do every single day at the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute, is we let you know what's actually underneath the policies that are being imposed, and what the real danger is from them and what the alternative is. So I would encourage people, don't be intimidated by this psychological warfare that's being employed to intimidate you, or to convince you there's no hope, or the consumer culture, which is saying, look, life is not worth it. Don't give up your pleasures like betting on the Super Bowl to support the idea of a mobilization for peace. Well, we may not have another Super Bowl after this one if this war is not stopped. And I would encourage people to take seriously what you heard from Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Go to our website and watch the full interview with Garland Nixon. and think for yourself. And that's the most important thing.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions, and then I'll do a closing question. I'll ask these two questions together, and then I'll do a closing question. So I guess this one is for Harley. The first one I'll do is for Harley, and then the second one is for you, Mike. But Harley, you're welcome to answer, and same for you, Mike, if you want to answer this first one too. There's a question from Anastasia. How do you recommend people organize after Seymour Hersh's article revelations? It seems to me that people should be intervening and demanding their governments do investigations.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's what Mrs. LaRouche did initially by putting out a statement calling on the Bundestag, since it's the German people who are the main targets of this, that there should be a full investigation. Get a hold of Helga's statement. If you live in Germany, get it out, wherever you live. I mean, here's an interesting question. Why should the German government tolerate the destruction of the cheap energy, which is a necessary part of the driver of its economic health? Why should they tolerate it being cut off by an explosion, if in fact Hersh is right, conducted by the United States, and everything points in that direction? How can you then stay in an alliance with the government in the United States, which is killing your people? So I think the most important thing is read the article, think it through. I mean, who benefited from this? You know, this is often the question you have to start with. Who benefits from this destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines? It's not Germany. It's not Russia. It's the United States and the United Kingdom that are the leaders of this war out to destroy Russia and to destroy Germany. So you don't have to be a German to be upset about this. And I think it's important that people take the statement from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, formulate your own statement if you want, but it's also the case that the American Congress should be forced to investigate it. Are we allowing the National Security Agency to conduct terrorism against necessary infrastructure? Are we going to allow that? Is that acceptable? If there's going to be a new church committee, if the Republicans are talking about investigating the corruption of the intelligence community, since this was an operation that Hersh says included the CIA and the Joint Chiefs and so on, shouldn't there be an investigation in the U.S. Congress into this? So that's what I would say in response to Anastasia's question.
Okay, perfect. Mike, this is the last question, and then one more. What are the benefits of Europe opposing Russia, since Russia is the energy supplier at large?
Don't see any benefits to it. In fact, as Harley said earlier, it's you know, Europe and Britain opposing Russia in the way that they are, imposing sanctions in the way that they are. We are destroying ourselves in the process. And the question is, why are we doing that? You know, if Britain sends 100 tanks to Ukraine, what difference is that going to make to Ukraine? Absolutely none. That's going to become 100 piles of scrap metal very, very quickly. The same with 100 aircraft. In the meantime, we're passing off billions and billions of pounds into this war operation. And as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, we've got excess mortality in the UK higher than we've ever seen outside of a pandemic year. So how is this benefiting us in any way? It's only benefiting the City of London and that type of mindset and that type of interest. It's not benefiting the people, and I think it's incumbent on everybody to be actually building some kind of serious opposition to this war policy and get the money being spent, if there is any, whatever money there is, being spent in the right areas. But death and destruction are never the right areas.
Okay. Harley, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Mike hit the key points.
Perfect. So the closing question, and then this will also be your final thoughts for the day. You know, Mike, you were going through these politicians and you're going through their various scandals and stuff, and we have very similar problems here in the United States. You know, maybe our politicians aren't as open about it in public as they are in the UK, but we have them, and our population knows it. You know, nobody intentionally votes for this person in their district or their party saying, you know, well, I hope this guy goes and, you know, gropes some women, or I hope this guy is a coke addict, right? Nobody votes for people to represent them who are of this quality, and yet they all end up being that. And so why is that, and what is going on with that, and how do we find justice when the people who are supposed to be giving the justice are just as corrupt as the ones we're trying to get justice from? So that's kind of a big thing, and let's go to you, Mike, first, and then Harley.
Well, I can only speak to the system in the UK because I don't know very well how this works in other countries. But in the UK, of course, the choice that you make at the polls is a false choice, because each party selects somebody to represent them. The independents, anybody who's independent that stands for election at a general election in the UK, has basically no opportunity. To give an example, if you stand as an independent in Plymouth here at the general election, the BBC will come and give you the opportunity to interview, but they will give you 6 seconds to say whatever, and that's the only coverage you will get. In the meantime, the main parties with their corrupt candidates will get all the airtime at the hustings, at the town hall meetings for where the public are able to go and interview or challenge the candidates. Independent candidates don't get on the stage with the mainstream candidates because they're not appropriate. We only want to hear from the Tory party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and maybe the Greens if they're lucky. So the electoral process is so utterly controlled that the choice that you have is really one corrupt guy versus another corrupt guy. Sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question, Jose.
Well, it's just, well, first of all, you said it's kind of different in UK than the US, but actually that is what it is here: Democrat versus Republican, corrupt versus corrupt. Well, the second part was just like, how did we get here? How do we fix it?
Well, look, this may not be, maybe Harley has a different view, but it seems to me that as corrupt as some of these people are, without engagement by the public in politics, without people actually engaging with their so-called representatives, these people are allowed to do what they do. I mean, the tagline that we use at the UK column is "He is silent is taken to agree." This is a legal maxim. If members of the public are sitting silent while MPs are groping young boys or calling for war or sending tanks to Ukraine, if members of the public are silent about that, then the presumption is that they agree with that policy. So, I think it's the how we deal with this is engagement, and that's where we need to start, is to get people engaged.
Okay, Harley?
Well, I think what Mike said is essentially right. I mean, what we're dealing with in politics is a kind of form of theater and entertainment, an ongoing soap opera, which is ultimately uses profiles, left and right, identity politics, and you don't engage the mind. Now, I think something that Ray McGovern said a couple weeks ago is really something people should think about. He said, think of the children. And here's the way I would pose it. What did a 4-year-old or 5-year-old boy or girl in Syria do that would make them a target of sanctions that might take their life? What are the parents of those children who are freezing now because they don't have blankets, they don't have fuel, they don't have housing, they don't have food? And the US government is continuing to impose sanctions. How can you tolerate a government like that would willfully conduct policy that will kill children. Or if it doesn't kill them, will make them miserable, stunt their growth, and destroy their potential. And I think that's where we have to start. Forget all the theater, forget the public relations and the nonsense that goes into politics. Where do people stand on these life and death issues of accepting the idea that nuclear war might be winnable and acceptable, accepting the idea that Russia has no right to security guarantees, accepting the idea that we should put more weapons into the hands of Ukrainians that will end up shortening their lives, and accepting the idea that government has a right to punish a government it doesn't like by killing its children. You know, if you can't tolerate that, then get out and mobilize and join us. And join us on not just on February 19th, but in building for it and in working with us, because we have an alternative which is based on the best tradition of all countries and all cultures and all religions, of recognizing the legitimate rights of all people. And I think that's the starting point we have to have when it comes to politics.
Okay, Mike Robinson, Harley Schlanger. I want to thank you guys for joining me this afternoon for the Saturday show for February 11th. As we close out our show, I just want to put out a couple things. First, Helga Zepp-LaRouche had proposed 10 principles of a new international security and development architecture, as you can see here on the screen. And I think this really goes to the theme of our presentations today. You know, and Helga here in the first paragraph puts the new paradigm, which will be characteristic of the new epoch and towards which the new global security and development architecture must be directed. Therefore, must eliminate the concept of oligarchism for good and proceed to organize the political order in such a way that the true character of humanity as a creative species can be realized. And I think as we enter into this new age of the world, you know, we do need to figure out a new way to communicate with different cultures and countries without threatening to blow each other up. And I think one of the ways that Helga's proposing to do that is through these 10 principles. And so you can find those on the Schiller Institute site. Secondly, I just want to remind people again of the rally that is happening in DC, the Rage Against the War Machine rally happening on February 19th. You know, we have different coalitions coming together, different organizations all coming together to sponsor this event. And we have a great list of speakers from Jimmy Dore, Tulsi Gabbard, Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, and our very own Diane Sayre, who will also be speaking. And lastly, I just want to remind people that tomorrow we will be having a marathon starting at noon of Lynn's videos, speeches, and ideas that will be broadcasted probably on this channel starting at noon Eastern time. That'll be 12 p.m. Eastern time. And so with that,